Chapter 10. There was no way I was going to sit on my hands while this power-hungry parasite threatened my family, my community, and 23 years of integration progress. If Gadsden wouldn't give me a job to do, I would make one for myself. I was suspended, not stuck in a cell. How I chose to spend my free time was up to me. Aurelius still had access to the magic registry and police databases, so we looked him up. Knowing what we did about his daughter, he wasn't too hard to find. Jason Hale. But for a man ready to massacre hundreds of thousands of people to get what he wanted, his records were bland and unenlightening. He had no criminal charges. He'd grown up in Nevada and had moved to Los Angeles to study and practice law. But he'd let his license lapse just 6 months after the Magic Revolution, possibly to pursue a magic-based career. Today, he had residences and driver's licenses listed in both California and Nevada, although his most recent vehicle was one of the self-driven variety. A marriage certificate said he had walked down the aisle 25 years ago, and a death certificate told us that he'd been widowed 12 years later, when Madison would have been about 5 years old. Probably not recent enough to have triggered the current course of events. Excuse me. It appeared he'd raised Madison single-handedly after that and sent her to one of the most expensive private schools. All indicators from police records and their social media accounts pointed to the idea that he'd led a relatively ordinary life of privilege and that he was in no way hurting for money. Well, that was good for him. About the only useful information we found was the Magic Registry's confirmation that Mr. Hale had been whacked with the lucky end of the magic stick. Unlike me or poor goldfish guy, he could create force fields. Really freaking big ones. And apparently he was the only known thing that could pass through them. But that was all his listing in the Magic Registry said. This wasn't unusual. Trying to track over 10 billion humans' individual magic gifts was a logistics nightmare. You either relied on self-reporting, which made it all but useless as a tool in fighting crime, or you expended far too many resources trying to identify and catalog everything. Even if you had the resources, you frequently had to take a person's word on the details and limits of their magic unless you had magical means of confirming it. And even if you somehow had all the information with guaranteed accuracy, recording and categorizing billions of powers with all of their own quirks and variations was a cataloging challenge for far smarter minds than mine. We looked at Madison anyway and discovered that her gift had been recorded as the ability to disappear from living creatures' sight. That would be interesting. It didn't go into her limitations or anything helpful like that, but it might shed some light on why Mr. Hale might have allowed his daughter to travel into Fairy in the hopes of illegally acquiring the artifact. I wanted more information on Jason Hale's magic, though, since his was the one keeping Las Vegas imprisoned. I chewed on my nails for a few seconds and then Googled Jason Hale force field. Sure enough, there was a website advertising his services, which he either hadn't thought or hadn't bothered to take down. HaleSecuritySolutions.com, he'd gotten really creative with his name there, informed us he worked as a freelance security specialist for a number of private, corporate, and government entities across Nevada, California, Utah, and Arizona. The high-end security business was a lucrative game, and James Hale had done very well for himself. His client list included everything from private collectors, museums, banks, and even a few of the casino vaults in Vegas. A thief and a security specialist, Aurelius mused. I wonder if they ever combined forces to pull one over on Hale's clients. I jerked my head around, decided I didn't care right now, and jotted down the 4 states on my notepad. That they all adjoined suggested that there was a limit to his magic, probably relating to distance. which meant wherever he was holed up, he had to be sort of close to Vegas. Unfortunately, a 4-state limit was still a lot of ground to cover, nearly 500,000 square miles. According to the unsubstantiated claims on his website, his force fields were impossible to break, pierce, puncture, blow up, unlock, drill through, or otherwise physically compromise. Even more notably, they reflected any magical attacks or manipulation from the outside and reacted violently to attempts at anti-magic disablement. No wonder his business had taken off. Unless that last detail was a fabrication that had been added to his website specifically for this hostage situation, I trusted the task force would test the validity of these claims. Of course, the weakest link in his security service was Hale himself. Kill him, and robbing Aunt Bertha of her collection of Fabergé cockatrice eggs suddenly became a lot easier. Or if you weren't the murderous type, you could threaten Hale into lowering the barrier for you. But Mr. Hale would have been all too aware of that vulnerability. Throughout his career, he must have invested a great deal of his wealth into personal protection. Even more so now. He'd known releasing that video would bring the full force of law enforcement down on him. Known and felt secure enough to do it anyway. Which meant getting to him would take much more luck than a winning streak at a casino. And while I was feeling slightly more optimistic after finally managing to wash most of the walrus skunk out of my hair in the hours that I had failed to sleep, lucky seemed like a stretch. I looked over the notes that I jotted down and then back to Hale's client list. The public version, anyway. The massive force field over Las Vegas had to be pushing his limits, right? I Googled one of the names at random and dialed the number that came up. Hello, this is the Art Preservation Society? Oh, good, yes. I'm calling because I just saw on the news that your security specialist, Jason Hale, has turned rogue. You might want to check the protection you hired him for. Is it still in place? The man on the other end sounded flustered. Oh, let me take a look. Oh my goodness, I don't believe it. The force field's down then? Suspicion replaced confusion. Who did you say was calling? Oh, just a concerned citizen. Have a nice day. I called the next client just to make sure the first one wasn't an anomaly. The woman who answered was shrewder than the first. She thanked me for the information, promised she'd have someone by the name of Valentino check it out, and hung up so I could not overhear the results. I tried another one at random and went through my opening spiel. Is this some sort of joke? The voice on the other end demanded. The entire residence has just been taken over by law enforcement, saying they'll be conducting testing on the force fields with the valuables inside. I swear, if they damage my boss's irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind... I scrunched some of my notepaper against the phone. Oh, I'm sorry. Cutting out. Aurelia snorted at this childish ruse, but I was itching to act on her information. And this way, the poor personal assistant was less likely to call me back. I tapped my pen against my now screwed up notepaper. So, the task force must be experimenting on smaller versions of Hale's force fields, ones without over 1 million people trapped inside? That's a good plan. Mr. Hale had probably never had the entire might of law enforcement putting his force field to the test. Maybe they'd find a way to break through. Well, then again, maybe they wouldn't. And it sounds like he's stretching himself pretty thin if he's letting some of his customers down. That's bad business 101 right there. Aurelis gave me her "you're an idiot" look. Dragon facial expressions aren't easy to read, but I've seen this one often enough to recognize it. Since he released his identity to the media, he can't be betting on his life ever being the same again. Why would he bother keeping his clients happy? You're right, geez. We both knew what that meant. Jason Hale had jumped in without a life jacket. All or nothing. He wasn't planning on returning, which meant that he would do anything to win. I ducked Torellus's lashing tail. All the more reason to bite off his stupid, smug head. Let's go check out his closest known address. We'll call this an end to chapter 10A for the day. I will acknowledge that, yes, I am sitting here in my bathrobe. I promise I am fully dressed. I'm just cold. All right. Okay, so learning about Jason Hale, and it sounds like we are about to go off to look for him. I wonder what misadventures shall follow. Stay tuned for chapter 10B. Mwah!